We've discussed how the market demand curve is created and also how the supply curve is created as well. Remember, this market demand is just the cumulative demand of all the individuals in this particular market. In this case, we're talking about everybody in Springfield, how many pounds of coffee beans they'll buy per year. And remember that market demand slopes downward. Opposite is the supply curve. It goes upward, but it's very similar to the market demand curve that we're taking this information from a schedule. In this case, we're taking it from the supply schedule, showing us how much producers would be willing to produce at different price levels. Slopes upwards because producers will produce more at higher prices in general. Now, when we bring all this together, we could actually figure out what's going on in the market. So we're looking for equilibrium price and equilibrium quantity. And notice where these two curves intersect. The intersection of supply and demand right here gives us our equilibrium point. So if we draw an arrow over to the left here and look at the y-axis, notice we're right at $3 per pound. That's going to be our equilibrium price. We expect that coffee in this market is going to sell for $3 a pound given the trends in supply and demand. Notice we drop down from that equilibrium point coming down towards the x-axis. All right, we hit 5. That's going to be our quantity, how much we expect to be sold in the market for a given year. We expect 5,000 pounds of coffee beans to be sold in Springfield for this particular year, given these facts about supply and demand. And we're always going to measure quantity sold down on this x-axis. Price is always going to be measured up here. So supply and demand, the intersection, tells us what we expect the market price and the market equilibrium to be. Now, when it really gets interesting and what poses a challenge for students is when we have changes in supply and changes in demand. And that's what we're interested in as economists. We want to know what's going on with markets, how are they evolving. So anytime we have a change in supply or demand, there's underlying numbers in the supply schedule or demand schedule have to be changing. Remember where these curves come from, right? These curves are coming from those schedules. So this demand curve comes from the numbers in the market demand schedule. Supply curve comes from the numbers in the market supply schedule. So if those numbers in the schedule change, well, the curves are going to move. They're going to be different. And if they move, that's going to give us new equilibrium price and quantity. So we're interested in knowing how is that price going to change? How is that quantity sold in the market going to change if we have a change in demand or a change in supply? There's a number of different factors that could affect these. First, we'll look at demand. Notice if we have an increase in demand, if demand picks up, say there's a whole bunch of people that want to buy coffee, new entrants into the market, new consumers, well, demand's going to kick out to the right. Notice where you see this D1, that just means the original demand schedule. So if we had demand kick out, well, D2, that just means demand curve number 2. All right, something happened to change demand. If it picked up, it goes out to the right. Notice we had a decrease in demand opposite case. It would move out towards the left. Now, a bunch of different reasons why we could have increases or decreases in demand. Just a couple of the most prominent ones, prices of related goods. If a substitute or complementary good, the price of that goes up or down, that can affect the demand for a good. For example, let's talk about substitutes. Think of goods like Coke and Pepsi. Maybe there's an individual who doesn't really care, doesn't have a big taste difference between Coke and Pepsi. So this particular person, they're willing to buy Coke or Pepsi interchangeably. Well, if they're the same price and the Coke price doubles all of a sudden, that person's probably more likely to buy Pepsi if the Pepsi price remained the same. So that was a substitute good. The substitute good changed price, Coke's price changed. That affects your demand for Pepsi. Probably the demand for Pepsi is going to go up in that case. So price-related goods, it affects the demand. Also, your income, that can affect demand. Generally, as our income goes up, we're going to demand more of most goods. We call those normal goods. A good's normal if we buy more of it as our income goes up. We could also have a decrease in demand as our income goes up. And goods that react like that are called inferior goods. And the one big example of this is ramen noodles. You always see this in economics textbooks as an example. College students or individuals that maybe don't have much money, they buy a lot of ramen noodles for meals because they're really, really cheap. But once they get out of school and they get a good job and they're making more money, they buy less ramen noodles. So as their income went up, they bought less of it. All right, that's a decrease in demand, and we call that an inferior good. When you have more money, you make more money, and you buy less of a particular good. Also, the number of buyers. There's more buyers in the market, that generally increases demand. Less buyers, demand goes down. Tastes and expectations also have a really great effect on demand. If something gets popular or it is really a high interest item, people want to buy a lot of it. Say a new video game comes out or a new computer, a new iPad comes out, everybody's going to rush out to the store. There's increased demand for that product. Likewise, some goods fall out of popularity. So if something isn't as popular, all right, we can have a decrease in demand. So any of these particular factors could affect that demand. Just as we had increases and decreases in demand, we could also have increases and decreases in supply. And notice we have here S1 standing for that initial supply curve, so that's our starting point. If the supply would increase for some reason, so that means producers are willing to produce more of a good at any given price level, well, that curve kicks out to the right. That's an increase in supply, S2. Notice that means that the numbers in that supply schedule are changing. Likewise, we could have a decrease. Say we were originally at S1 and something happened to decrease supply. Maybe the number of suppliers dropped out, a couple firms went out of business. Well, we're going to have a kick back to the left. Pushes over to the left, you have here S3, all right, that reduced supply. A couple different reasons this could happen, just like we had different possibilities for reasons why the demand curve shifted. Number of different possibilities here. I'm not going to go through each one of these explicitly, just to talk about a couple of the big ones. The number of suppliers, like we mentioned, if there's less suppliers in the market, say a number of those farmers growing coffee beans went out of business, well, probably not as much supply out there. That's a reduction in supply. Say the number of farmers doubles overnight, a bunch of people start planting coffee beans. That's going to be extra supply. Everything else held equal, we'd expect prices to go down. Another big driver of supply curve shifts, technology. All right, as technology changes, usually we get better at producing things. All right, technology advances over time, and that means companies are able to produce more of a good at a given price level. That's an increase in supply. So any of these different factors here can cause the supply curve to increase or decrease. So your job as a student when you're working through these problems is try to figure out what's going on in a given scenario. Is supply increasing and decreasing? Once you figure that out, then it's all mechanics. If you know supply is increasing, all right, the supply curve just moves out to the right. If you figure out it's decreasing, it moves to the left. Once you know that, you just plot it on your graph. From there, you could figure out what happened to price and what happened to quantity. So what we're going to do is go through a couple examples here and show how to do this in abstract terms. So recall the example that we had with the coffee beans. I gave you actual concrete numbers there. So that's not always the case though. When we look at our textbook, we're not always given those numbers. So I want to show you how to make sense of some of those diagrams that we see in the textbook. So first off, let's look at an example where we have an increase in demand. And all these different diagrams are going to start off the same way. We have our typical supply and demand diagram. We have that supply curve that's upward sloping, demand curve downward sloping. And I'll go here and I'll mark this as S1, indicating that's our initial supply. Down here is our initial demand. Notice our equilibrium point in the middle there. We always go across, and my drawing isn't the best here with this tool, but that's going to be our initial price level, price 1. We drop down along here. That's our initial quantity, Q1. All right, notice that's a little bit different than the supply and demand curves we've seen with the coffee beans. I didn't give you P1 or Q1. I told you, it was $3 or $4 is the price, and I gave you numbers for the quantity. So most of the examples in the book look at it like this. We're not looking at the actual numbers. We just want to know the direction. So you're going to have to get used to using these variables or understanding these variables. Now, if we had an increase in demand, remember what happens. Demand's kicking out. People want to purchase more of a particular good at a given price. Well, if that's the case, demand is moving out to the right. All right, so notice we have a new demand curve. We're going to call that D2. So we move from D1 to D2. Well, notice what happens. We have a new equilibrium point. And you can see the supply hasn't changed, right? No change in the supply curve, right? Same supply curve, just S1, but we want to figure out what the new equilibrium point is. Well, notice S1 was our original demand, original supply rather, hasn't changed, but we have a new demand. Demand changed from D1 to D2, so we want to see where the current new curves intersect. Well, right here. And we bring it across here. Notice price went up. We went from P1 to P2. The way we know it went up, P2 is higher up along that y-axis than P1, so we know that the price had to go up. Now notice we're not given any numbers, so I don't know if it went from 3 to 4 or 3 to 5 or 3 to 100, but I know price in the market went up because demand kicked up. Likewise, we could look at quantity. We come down from here, we have a new quantity, Q2. Again, quantity sold in the market went up. It pushed out. The reason we know that is it's moving along that x-axis. You think about how an axis is numbered, 1, 2, 3, and so on. All right, the numbers go up as we go farther right. Well, we started with this quantity. The new quantity, Q2, I don't know what the number is, but it's farther right along the x-axis, so it has to be higher. So in this case, the end result of all this work is prices went up and quantity went up. That's what we're interested in knowing with these supply and demand diagrams. We had a change in demand. We want to know what happens to prices and what happens to quantity if everything else was held equal. So it's a little bit different than how we looked at it before because there's no numbers, but most of the graphs you see in your book, right, have these variables, P1, P2, Q1, Q2. So I know students have a lot of trouble with that sometimes when they move from those numbers to these more abstract variables. So I just wanted to break that down for you. So that's an example of an increase in demand. Notice that curve moved out to the right, all right, pushed out to the right because demand increased, went out in that direction. Now we could have a situation where we had a decrease in demand, be the opposite case. So let's take a look at that. And again, we're going to start in the very same way. All right, we always start with our base case, supply and demand curves crossing one another. So again, we always start with S1 as our original supply curve and D1 as our original demand curve, and that supply is always upward sloping, demand's downward sloping. And I'll draw this over to this point here, and that's our original price, and come down from here, that's our original quantity. All right, so that's our starting point. Basically what that's saying is before we had this change in demand, this was the price in the market, P1. This is how much is being sold in the market, Q1. Very abstract, right? You're not getting numbers. I'm not telling you the exact price in the market or the exact number of, let's say, coffee being sold. It's more in abstract terms. And we don't really need the numbers here because we're just looking at what direction price goes, what direction quantity goes in. All right, so if we had a decrease in demand, remember, if demand decreases, it's pushing back in this direction. We're going down to D2, all right? Going to the left. All right, so we have that demand curve D2. We still have the original supply curve S1. That gives us a new equilibrium point. So we want to know what happens with price. Draw over here. Notice price went down. We're going downwards on that y-axis. We want to know what's going on with quantity. Well, I have the new point here. Quantity kicked out more towards the left. That means it's going down. So in this example, price goes down, quantity goes down. That's the end result. So anytime we have a decrease in demand and nothing changes with supply, we expect price to go down, we expect quantity to go down. So some of the questions you've had on your quizzes and maybe questions you'll see on the test will give you a scenario. This happens in the market. There's a change. You have to recognize, is that a change in demand or supply? And is it going up or down? Once you know that, you could plot these changes, figure out what happens to price and quantity. All right, so that's kind of making sense of changes in demand. Let's do the same thing for supply. Same idea. All right, first off, let's look at an increase in supply. And going back to the example of the coffee beans, we could have an increase in supply from the fact that maybe there's more growers out there. So maybe more farmers are out growing coffee beans. All right, theoretically, we could have greater supply because of that. We want to plot out and see what happens to price and what happens to quantity. So again, we go back to our starting point, figure out what's going on here originally. And again, have our original supply curve. And we have our original demand curve down here. All right, and we plot out that original price and original quantity. All right, so very same basics we did to start all these problems. So we want to know if there's an increase in supply, what's going to happen with that price, what's going to happen with that quantity. That's always what we're asking, what's going on with price and quantity. Remember, if supply increased, well, it's moving out to the right, moving out like this. All right, so new equilibrium point, and of course we call that curve S2. Alright, so plot the point, see what happens to price. Well, notice our price went down and quantity went up. Alright, so if there's no change in demand and our supply increases, we expect prices to go down and quantity to go up. That would make sense. If we have a bunch of new farmers in the market, there's a whole bunch more coffee beans out there, well, greater supply, our prices should go down, and obviously there's more beans out there, quantity sold should go up. Alright, so that was an increase in supply. Increases in supply are good for consumers. We like that. We like lower prices as consumers. So let's look at the last case. We could have a decrease in supply. So again, very same setup. We have a base case, plot it out. We just want to look at what our initial price is, P1, what our initial quantity is, it's Q1, and I always like to label these supply and demand curves just so we don't get lost here. Supply is always upward slope and demand is downward slope, and so that's our initial point. Notice supply decreased, it went down. Alright, so supply pushes back like that. Well, prices go up. If there's less supply, we expect prices would go up. Come down to this axis. Alright, quantity goes down as well. So if we have a decrease in supply, less coffee beans are sold. This is the case where maybe there is a big drought in South America. Well, if there's a drought and there's not as many coffee beans grown, when you go to buy coffee, you're going to pay more for it. Prices go up. Alright, less is being sold in the market. Quantity goes down. Alright, so that was just a very quick tutorial of what's going on with supply and demand graphics. Maybe it helps a little bit for me to go through that with you as opposed to just reading it through the book. If you don't understand that, watch the video again. Feel free to contact me if you have any questions.